The gavel came down so hard, it cracked the edge of Mayor Harlan Duval's oak desk, and the sound ricocheted off the walls of the Redemption Creek courthouse like a gunshot. "You will sign that eviction order, Sheriff Cade, or so help me, I will have your badge before sundown." Zane Cade stood with his arms crossed, 6 feet 2 inches of iron-jawed stubbornness, his dark eyes fixed on the mayor with the kind of steady, unflinching calm that had made outlaws sweat through their shirts across 3 counties. The silver star pinned to his chest caught the morning light slanting through the courthouse window, and for a long, suspended moment, nobody in that room breathed. Behind the mayor stood Deputy Walt Ferris and 2 of the town council members, men who had grown fat and comfortable under Duval's protection, men who had learned long ago that it cost nothing to nod along and everything to push back. They watched Zane with a mixture of awe and dread. On the folding chair beside the door sat the woman who had started all of this, though she did not yet know the full storm she had walked into. Bridget Marlowe had her hands folded in her lap, and her chin lifted just slightly, the way a person holds themselves when they are determined not to show fear, even though every nerve inside them is screaming. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, her traveling dress still dusty from the road, and she had arrived in Redemption Creek exactly 9 days ago carrying nothing but a leather satchel, a land deed, and the kind of quiet, unbreakable resolve that Zane had spent his entire adult life learning to recognize in people. "I said no," Zane told the mayor, his voice quiet and absolutely final. "I will not sign it, not today, not tomorrow, not ever." The betrayal in Duval's eyes was almost theatrical. He had promoted Zane to sheriff 2 years ago, had publicly championed him, had told anyone who would listen that Zane Cade was the finest lawman in the Arizona Territory. And now this, over a woman none of them knew. Over a piece of land that Duval wanted badly enough to lie, cheat, and forge documents to get it. "You are throwing away everything," Duval said, his voice dropping to something colder and more dangerous than the shouting. "Your position, your reputation, your future in this town. For what?" For her? Zane did not look at Bridget. He kept his eyes on the mayor, because looking away even for a second would signal hesitation, and he had none. He had made his choice the moment he had seen the forgery, had understood the trap being laid for a woman who had done nothing wrong except inherit land that a powerful man wanted. "For the law," Zane said, "which is what you hired me to uphold." He turned then, unhooking his thumbs from his belt and walking toward the door, and the room felt like it shifted on its axis as everyone watched him reach past Bridget to pull the door open. "After you, Miss Marlowe," he said. She looked up at him, those dark eyes measuring, searching, not yet trusting but something else flickering there, something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way a person feels when they realize, for the first time in a very long time, that they are not entirely alone. It had started on a Tuesday. The Butterfield Overland stage rolled into Redemption Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon, carrying 4 passengers, a mail pouch, and approximately 40 pounds of dust from the Tucson Road. Zane was standing on the covered boardwalk outside the sheriff's office when it arrived, not because he was expecting anyone but because he always stood there in the afternoon, partly out of habit and partly because watching the street was the only way to catch trouble before it started. The year was 1878, and Redemption Creek had been growing fast, the way small Arizona Territory towns grew fast in those years, messily and with too much money moving through too few hands. There was a silver mine 8 miles east that had produced steadily for 4 years. A cattle operation owned by a man named Hector Baines that employed 30 riders, and a main street of businesses that had been built quick and cheap, and were always in danger of going up in a single fire. The town needed law, and Zane Cade had provided it, reliably and without sentiment, since the spring of 1876. He watched the stage passengers step down. A traveling salesman with a sample case. An older couple from back east visiting someone local, he supposed. A man in a gray suit who looked like a lawyer and carried himself accordingly. And then Bridget Marlowe. She came down the stage steps last, holding her satchel close, and she stood on the street and looked at Redemption Creek with an expression that was not quite disappointment and not quite determination, but some particular mixture of both that Zane found himself studying longer than he should have. She was not what he would have called obviously remarkable. She was simply a young woman in a practical brown traveling dress with her dark hair pinned up, looking at a dusty frontier town the way someone looks at a problem they have decided they are going to solve. She walked straight to the general store, which was also where the land office operated out of a back room, and that was the last Zane saw of her for the rest of that day. He heard about her the next morning, because in a town of 800 people, everyone heard about everything by morning. Nora Finch, who ran the rooming house and also served as the most efficient information network in 3 counties, told him over the breakfast she always left on the counter of the sheriff's office that a young woman had arrived claiming to own the Harlan Flats property, and that it had caused quite a stir at the land office. Zane had eaten his eggs and thought nothing much of it, because land disputes were common and not inherently his business, unless they turned violent. It became his business 3 days later when Bridget Marlowe walked into his office and set a folded document on his desk. "Sheriff Cade," she said, "someone has been on my land." He looked up from the wanted poster he had been reading and found her standing in front of his desk with her hands clasped in front of her, composed and direct, meeting his gaze without any of the fluttering uncertainty that some people brought to official offices. "Miss Marlowe," he said, because he had been told her name by Nora and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "You know who I am." "Small town," he said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and she sat down. "Tell me what you found." The Harlan Flats property, she explained, was approximately 400 acres of land in the fertile valley northeast of town, bounded on the east by a creek, and on the west by the old fence line of the Baines cattle property. Her father, Thomas Marlowe, had purchased it in 1871 and held the deed through the Tucson Land Registry. He had died 8 months ago in St. Louis, where he and Bridget had been living since 1873, having never developed the Arizona land but always intending to. His will left everything to his daughter. "When I arrived to survey the property," Bridget said, "there were fence posts installed along the northern boundary that were not shown on the original survey maps. They appear to have been placed to absorb approximately 60 acres of the southern portion of my property into the adjacent land." Zane was quiet for a moment. "Whose land sits south of yours?" She looked at him with the directness he was beginning to understand was simply her way. "The land registered to Meridian Development, which, if the county records are accurate, is a company organized under the name of Mayor Harlan Duval." There it was, the thing that turned a simple land dispute into something with teeth. Zane had known for some time that Duval had business interests that went beyond the mayor's salary, and he had deliberately not looked too closely at them, which he recognized now, sitting across from this woman, as its own kind of moral failure. He had told himself it was not his jurisdiction. He had told himself that without evidence there was nothing to pursue. He had been, he understood in retrospect, making the easiest choice available to him at each decision point, and those choices had accumulated into a kind of complicity he was not comfortable acknowledging. "I will look into it," he told her. "I would appreciate that," she said. She stood and picked up her satchel. Then she paused at the door and turned back. "Sheriff, I want to be transparent with you about something. I have been to see 4 different officials in this town in the past 3 days. The land office clerk told me my deed might be a forgery. The county surveyor told me he did not have time to review the boundary dispute for at least 6 weeks. The lawyer in town told me he could not take my case. I am not yet certain whether Redemption Creek has a genuine legal problem it cannot resolve, or whether the problem has been created deliberately. I suspect the latter. I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know it before you decide whether to look into it." She walked out and left him with the distinct, uncomfortable feeling of someone who has been measured and found either adequate or wanting, and the uncertainty of which one it was. He spent the next 2 days in the records room of the county land office, going through deed filings and survey documents and property registrations with the kind of methodical patience he had developed over years of detective work. By the end of the 2nd day, he had found 3 things that were wrong. The first was that the Harlan Flats property deed held by Meridian Development, registered 6 months ago, carried a notary seal from a notary in Tucson who had, according to records Zane subsequently telegraphed to check, died in 1876. The seal had been copied and applied fraudulently to a document that claimed Thomas Marlowe had sold the southern portion of his Harlan Flats property to Meridian Development in 1875. Thomas Marlowe had been alive in 1875. He had not sold the land. The document was a forgery. The second was that the county surveyor had apparently already completed a boundary assessment of the Harlan Flats property within the past month, contrary to what he had told Bridget about a 6-week waiting period, and the assessment had been filed in support of Duval's boundary claim. The third was that the land office clerk's suggestion that Bridget's original deed might be a forgery appeared to have been made entirely without basis, since her deed checked against the original Tucson registry records and was entirely legitimate. Zane sat in the records room for a long time after he found these things, looking at the documents spread across the table and understanding that the situation he was now in had no good options. He was looking at evidence that the mayor of his town had committed fraud, had corrupted at least 2 other officials, and had done so to steal land from a young woman who had arrived alone and without local allies. And he was the sheriff, which meant what he did next would define exactly what kind of man he was. He thought about his dark past, about the years before Redemption Creek, about the reasons he had wanted to be a lawman in the first place. He had grown up in Texas, the son of a man who had watched his own land stolen through exactly this kind of legal manipulation: the forged deed, the corrupted officials, the quiet collusion of powerful men who understood that the law could be shaped like clay in the right hands. His father had spent 4 years fighting it and lost, and the loss had broken something in him that never healed. Zane had watched that happen, and had made a decision at 18 years old that he would learn the law well enough to use it as a weapon against the kind of men who weaponized it against ordinary people. That was the hidden motive behind his career, the thing he had never told anyone, the origin story he had kept private because the last thing a lawman needed in a town like this was for people to know what he cared about enough to fight for. He gathered the documents. He made precise, careful copies of everything, which he then sent by the evening post to the Tucson Federal Land Office and to the U.S. Marshal's office in Phoenix. He kept the originals, and then he went to tell Bridget Marlowe what he had found. She was at the rooming house, sitting on the small porch with a cup of tea, reading a book with the kind of absorbed attention that made him feel briefly intrusive, like arriving at the wrong moment in someone's private life. She looked up when he came up the porch steps, and her expression shifted from concentration to something watchful and contained. "You found something," she said. It was not a question. He sat down in the other chair on the porch without being invited, and she did not seem to mind, which he noted without understanding yet why he was noting it. He laid out what he had found in plain, precise language: the forged deed, the corrupted survey, the dead notary's fraudulent seal. He watched her face as he spoke and saw very little outward reaction, just a kind of focused attention, the same expression she had worn in his office, absorbing information and processing it somewhere internal. When he finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 15 seconds, which felt much longer. "What happens now?" she asked. "I have already sent copies of the evidence to the Federal Land Office and the Marshal," he said. "It is out of the local system now. Duval will not be able to bury it." "But it will take time," she said. "Yes. And in the meantime, he controls the local officials and can make life very difficult for anyone challenging him." "Yes," Zane said again. "He can." Another silence. The sun was getting low, and the light coming over the rooftops of Redemption Creek had turned amber, and Bridget was looking at it with an expression he could not categorize, something between resignation and steeliness. She was not afraid, he realized. Or rather, she might be afraid somewhere underneath everything, but she had made the decision not to let it matter, and that decision sat on her like armor. "I appreciate what you have done," she said, and then, carefully, "it puts you in a difficult position with the mayor." "I have been in difficult positions before," Zane said. She looked at him then, directly, the way she had in his office, but differently now, without the measuring calculation of a first meeting, with something more searching. "Why are you helping me? You do not know me." It was the right question, and he did not have a simple answer for it. The complicated answer involved his father's lost farm and his own dark history, and the particular fury he felt when he saw powerful men use bureaucratic machinery to grind ordinary people down. But he was not going to say any of that, not on a porch at sunset to a woman he had known for 3 days. "It is the law," he said, which was true even if it was not the whole truth. "Your deed is legitimate and theirs is forged. That is what the law says, and I am supposed to enforce the law." She looked at him a moment longer, as if she suspected there was more to it but was choosing not to press. "Well," she said, "thank you, Sheriff Cade." "Zane," he said, and was surprised to hear himself say it, a very slight shift in her expression, something that might almost have been a smile. "Bridget," she said. He walked back to his office through the amber dusk of the Arizona evening and spent the next hour pointedly not thinking about the way she had looked at him. Duval found out within 2 days. Zane had not expected to keep it secret, and he had not tried to. What he had not anticipated was the speed with which the mayor moved, the particular viciousness of a cornered man who believed himself untouchable. The mayor called Zane to his office on a Thursday morning, and what Zane expected was confrontation, and what he got instead was, in some ways, worse. Duval was genial. He offered whiskey at 10 in the morning, which Zane declined. He spoke expansively about the growth of Redemption Creek, about the opportunities it presented to men of vision. He talked about the silver mine, and the cattle money, and the eastward railroad line that was projected to reach the region within 3 years. "The Harlan Flats property," Duval said finally, circling back after 15 minutes of this, "is centrally located to become one of the most valuable pieces of ground in the territory once the railroad comes through. That is not nothing. And the Marlowe woman, Whatever her family paid for it in 1871 is sitting on a gold mine she does not even know the extent of. I am aware, Zane said. I am offering her fair compensation, Duval said. More than fair. The number I have in mind would keep her comfortable for years. I am not a greedy man, Zane. I understand the value of everyone winning. The deed dispute would need to be resolved first, Zane said, since her ownership is not currently in question. The deed dispute, Duval said with a careful smile, can be resolved very quickly if the parties involved choose cooperation over confrontation. These things are rarely as complicated as they seem. He was offering Zane a share in it, Zane realized, or the suggestion of one. Or at least the suggestion that going along would be remembered and rewarded. It was the kind of corrupt bargain that got made in exactly this kind of language, oblique and plausibly deniable, the kind where no one ever said the bad thing out loud but everyone understood what was meant. Zane stood up. I have sent the evidence to the Federal Land Office and the Marshal, he said. It is out of our hands now. Whatever they determine about the deed, the local court will need to comply. Duval's geniality evaporated. Not completely, but enough to see the coldness underneath it, the calculating intelligence of a man who had built considerable power in this territory and did not intend to let a sheriff, even a good one, dismantle it. You are making a mistake, Duval said. I have made them before, Zane said, and left. The 2 weeks that followed were the most pressured of his time in Redemption Creek. Duval worked through intermediaries, through the town council, through the deputy who owed his position to the mayor's patronage. There were 3 separate complaints filed against Zane in the county record for alleged misuse of his official position. Each complaint was fabricated, and each one required hours of documentation to rebut. His deputy stopped speaking to him except in monosyllables. 2 of the town's merchants, men who depended on Duval's goodwill for favorable arrangements, stopped acknowledging Zane when he walked past. He had been through versions of this isolation before, the way a community closes ranks around power even when it knows that power is rotten, and he had learned to treat it as information about the community rather than as personal injury. It did not make it comfortable. What made the 2 weeks bearable was an unexpected thing. He found himself in the habit of walking past the rooming house in the early evenings, not always stopping, but often enough that Bridget began appearing on the porch around the same time, and they fell into a kind of conversation that was unlike anything Zane had experienced in years. She was from St. Louis by way of a dozen different places, the daughter of a surveyor and amateur naturalist who had raised her to read maps and identify plants and argue rigorously about things she cared about. She had worked as a schoolteacher in St. Louis after her father's health declined, and she had done it well but without the sense that it was the thing she was meant to be doing. The land in Arizona had represented something for her father, a dream deferred and then lost, and coming to claim it had been, she admitted one evening, as much about honoring him as about practical economics. He always said the land would anchor us, she told Zane one evening, sitting on the porch steps with the stars coming out over the desert in the way they came out in Arizona, sudden and overwhelming, as if the dark was releasing them all at once. That we had spent so long moving that we had become the kind of people who did not know how to stay. He wanted to stay. Did you? Zane asked. She was quiet for a moment. I am learning to want it, she said. He told her things too, more than he intended to, more than he had told anyone in Redemption Creek in 2 years. The Texas childhood, his father's lost land, the years working as a hired detective before he had settled into the steadier work of a sheriff's office. He told her about the dark past that had brought him here, the years that had made him distrust comfort and attachment, the reasons he had built his life around work and duty rather than the softer things. She listened in the way he had noticed. She did everything, completely, without interrupting, without performing sympathy. When he finished, she said, "You have spent a very long time being useful and not much time being known." It landed somewhere inside him with the quiet force of something true, and he did not answer it, and she did not require him to. What he felt for her was not immediate or simple. It built in layers: the recognition of her intelligence, the respect for her courage, the particular and growing warmth that came from being seen by someone who looked carefully at what was actually there rather than what they expected. He told himself it was not the time for this, that they were in the middle of a legal battle with a powerful and ruthless man, and that complications were a luxury he could not afford. He told himself this every evening, and then showed up the next evening anyway and sat with her until the stars were fully out. He took a step back and she let him take it, and neither of them said anything about it, and they both went inside, and the moment sat between them after that like something they were both choosing carefully not to touch: the letter from the U.S. Marshall arrived on a Monday, 3 weeks after Zane had sent the evidence. It was addressed to the Redemption Creek Sheriff's Office, and it confirmed that the Marshal's office had reviewed the documentation and found sufficient evidence of fraud to warrant an investigation. A federal investigator would be dispatched to Redemption Creek within 2 weeks. In the interim, the letter stated, all pending eviction or displacement actions related to the Harlan Flats property were to be suspended pending federal review. Zane read the letter twice and then walked it directly to Bridget. He watched her read it and saw something happen in her face that she had been working very hard not to show for 3 weeks. The relief, the release of tension she had been holding since before she arrived in Redemption Creek. Maybe since her father had died and left her with this fight to finish for him. Her eyes went bright and then deliberately steady, and she folded the letter with great precision and held it in both hands. "It is not over," she said. "I know that." "No," he agreed, "but the federal involvement means it is on record at a level Duval cannot interfere with." "He will know this letter came," she said. "He will move before the investigator arrives." She was right, and Zane had already thought the same thing. Duval was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully or early. He was the kind of man who, when cornered, looked for the trap he could still spring. And what Zane had been turning over in his mind since that morning was what form that trap might take. The eviction order was technically under local jurisdiction, an emergency injunction based on a claim of squatter habitation, which was absurd since Bridget was staying at the rooming house and not even living on the land. But the law could be bent this way in a place where the man who bent it controlled the local courts. It was an attempt to force a physical removal before the federal investigation arrived, to present the investigator with a fait accompli. Zane had looked at it and understood it completely and said no, and walked out with Bridget beside him into the Arizona morning. They stood on the boardwalk outside the courthouse, and Bridget was very still beside him. Around them, the town moved through its morning business, wagons in the street, the sound of a hammer from the new construction on the East End, a woman calling to her child from a doorway. Normal life proceeding around the edge of an extraordinary situation. "What happens now?" Bridget asked. "He will try other avenues," Zane said. "He still controls the local court. He may find a judge willing to issue the injunction through a different mechanism. We need to be ready for that." "And your position?" she asked. He was serious about the badge. "He may be," Zane said, "but he cannot remove a sheriff without county approval, and he does not have it, not yet." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression he had not seen before, something that had pushed through the composed practicality she wore like a second skin. "You gave up a great deal in there," she said quietly. "I need you to know that I understand that, what it costs." What he was offering you. "He was offering me complicity," Zane said. "I am not in the market for it. Still," she said, "thank you." The words were simple, and she meant them simply, and something about the simplicity of it got through in a way that longer speeches did not. He looked at her on that boardwalk in the morning light and felt, without ambiguity, that he was precisely where he was supposed to be. What he did not yet know was that Duval, the morning after the courthouse confrontation, did something more dangerous than pursuing legal avenues. He sent his hired men to the Harlan Flats property with instructions to begin dismantling the creekside fence, the boundary marker most visible from the main approach road, in order to create a physical fact of boundary alteration before the federal investigator arrived. Zane found out about it from old Cy Reeves, who ran a feed operation north of town and had ridden past the property that morning and seen 3 men working on the fence line with tools and horses. Cy was not a political man and had no stake in the dispute, but he was scrupulous about fact and came to find Zane at noon to report what he had seen. Zane went to the property himself that afternoon. He took no deputy, since his deputy was compromised, and he went alone on his gray horse, coming over the rise that gave the first view of the Harlan Flats land, and the sight of it struck him with unexpected force. He had known the property by its legal dimensions and descriptions, but he had not stood on it before, and what it actually was beautiful. The valley opened out below the rise in a spread of grassland cut through by the silver thread of the creek, with stands of cottonwood along the water and a red mesa to the northeast that caught the afternoon light like a lamp. It was the kind of land a person might look at and understand immediately why it had occupied a dying man's dreams. The 3 men Duval had sent were still there when Zane arrived. They had taken down a 60-foot section of the original fence and were in the process of setting new posts several feet into what was legally Bridget's property. They stopped when Zane rode up in the largest of them. A man named Pollard, who worked the Meridian development operation, looked at Zane with the flat eyes of a man who had been told to expect trouble and not to be moved by it. "You are on private land," Zane said. "Specifically, on land currently under federal review and subject to a suspension of all modification orders from the U.S. Marshal's office. I have that letter in my office. I need you to stop what you are doing and leave this property." Pollard did not move immediately. He looked at Zane with a calculation that was not quite defiance, but was not quite compliance either, the calculation of a man weighing the cost of different choices. Eventually, the federal authority won, as it usually did when cited directly and clearly. Pollard said nothing but put down his tools, and his 2 men followed suit, and they loaded the tools into their wagon and drove back toward town. Zane spent an hour on the property after they left, walking the boundary, taking mental notes on what had been disturbed and what could be documented. He stood at the creek for a while with his horse drinking beside him and looked at the cottonwoods and the mesa, and understood why Thomas Marlowe had bought this land and never let it go. He brought Bridget to see it the next day. He told himself it was practical, that she needed to see the fence disturbance before the federal investigator arrived so that she could provide a first-hand account of the boundary alteration attempt. And that was true. But he also wanted her to see it, to see the thing she had been fighting for and understand its reality in a way that legal descriptions could not provide. They rode out in the morning, Bridget on a bay horse from the livery stable, comfortable in the saddle in a way that spoke of a childhood spent outdoors before city life had intervened. When they came over the rise and the valley opened below them, she stopped her horse and sat very still for a long moment, looking at it. "Oh," she said softly. That was all. Just one syllable, but it held everything in it, recognition and grief and something that was the beginning of hope. They rode down together and walked the property for 2 hours. Zane showed her the fence disturbance and explained what the three men had been doing, and she listened and asked precise questions and made mental notes with the methodical intelligence that he had come to expect from her. But it was clear she was also doing something else, something that had nothing to do with legal strategy, walking the ground, standing in the cottonwood shade beside the creek, turning in a slow circle to take in the mesa and the grass and the whole wide sky of it. He loved this place without ever seeing it, she said of her father, standing at the creek's edge with her boots near the water. He read everything he could find about this area: soil quality, rainfall, elevation. He knew it better in theory than I think he knew any place he actually lived. What did he want to do with it? Zane asked. Farm it mostly, she said. Small scale, vegetables, some orchard trees if the soil would take them. He was not a ranching man. He wanted something quieter than cattle. She paused. He used to say that land is the one thing that stays. That everything else in a life moves and changes, but land stays and waits for you. Zane thought about his father's land in Texas, the farm that had been taken from them, the fields he had run through as a child that now belonged to someone else. Sometimes it does not, he said. She looked at him. No, she said. Sometimes people take it, but that is different from the land leaving. The land itself stays. He did not know exactly when during those 2 hours the atmosphere between them shifted, only that it did, gradually and then not gradually at all. The way weather changes in the desert, the stillness before and then the whole sky altered. They were walking back toward their horses along the creek bank when she stumbled on a root hidden under the grass, and he caught her arm and she caught his, and they were close enough that he could see the fine detail of her face, the light scatter of freckles across her nose that he had not noticed before, the particular steady dark of her eyes. She did not step back immediately. Neither did he. They stood in the cottonwood shade with the creek running past them and the mesa red and blazing in the morning light, and what had been carefully left untouched between them for 3 weeks asked to be touched. He said, "Bridget." She said, "I know," which answered everything and nothing and also everything. He let go of her arm and she let go of his, and they walked back to the horses without speaking and rode back to town side by side in a silence that was not awkward but was full, densely full, of things that had been recognized. The federal investigator, a man named August Holt from the U.S. Marshal's office, arrived in Redemption Creek on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after Zane's letter, which was faster than expected and immediately improved the tactical situation. Holt was a small, precise man in his 40s who wore a brown suit and had the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had investigated a great many frauds and knew that speed was less valuable than method. Zane met him at the stage and walked him to the sheriff's office and spent 3 hours presenting the evidence, the original Tucson deed, the forged Meridian Development document with its dead notary's fraudulent seal, the county survey records showing the fabricated timeline, the letter detailing the fence disturbance, and the emergency eviction order. Holt took notes in a small leather-bound book and asked questions that told Zane he understood exactly what he was looking at. Duval, when he learned of Holt's arrival, attempted an approach that might have worked on a lesser investigator. He invited Holt to dinner that evening and presented himself as a cooperative civic leader who welcomed federal oversight and had, in fact, been in the process of reviewing the deed dispute himself when the sheriff's premature escalation had created an unnecessary federal matter from what was essentially a routine boundary disagreement. Holt listened to all of this with great politeness and wrote it down in his small book, and asked several questions about the date and identity of the notary on the Meridian Development deed. Duval's answer, Holt noted, was not consistent with the registry records from Tucson. What followed was a week of official interviews and document examination, during which Redemption Creek's political atmosphere underwent the particular shift that happens when powerful people begin to understand that the protection has evaporated. The county surveyor recanted his filed assessment and admitted under questioning by Holt that he had been directed by Duval to complete the survey in a manner favorable to Meridian development. The land office clerk admitted that his suggestion that Bridget's deed might be fraudulent had not been based on any actual examination of the document, but on a conversation with Deputy Ferris. Deputy Ferris, when questioned, resigned his position rather than answer questions about his involvement. Through all of this, Bridget conducted herself with a precision and composure that left Holt visibly impressed. She had organized her evidence methodically, had documentation of every interaction she had had with every local official since arriving, and answered every question concisely and without embellishment. Watching her work through the formal interview process, Zane felt something he identified after a moment as pride, which surprised him by its intensity. Duval, on the 5th day of the investigation, attempted one final hidden motive play. He approached Zane privately in the evening on the street outside the Redemption Creek Hotel and made what was clearly meant to be his last offer. "Drop the evidentiary support," Duval said. "Tell Holt that some of the documents may have been misfiled, and the investigation is based on a misunderstanding. The Marlowe woman gets compensated, generously, the property matter is settled privately, and nothing that needs to destroy anyone's career gets put in a federal record." "The county surveyor has already testified," Zane said. "Testimony can be walked back," Duval said. "Not federal testimony." Duval looked at him for a long moment. The calculation in his face was still there, but there was something else now, something that might in another man have been the beginning of the understanding that a thing was truly over. "You know what you are doing to this town," he said. "What the fallout from a federal fraud conviction does to a place like this. The investors, the railroad conversations, the development money, all of it stops." "The only thing that stops," Zane said, "is fraud. The rest of it is just business, and business can happen without it." He walked away, and that was the last private conversation he had with Harlan Duval. The formal federal findings came 10 days after Holt's arrival. The Meridian Development deed to the southern portion of the Harlan Flats property was declared fraudulent. The original Thomas Marlowe deed, now legally in Bridget Marlowe's name, was confirmed as the valid and controlling document. The boundary adjustments made to the northern fence line were ordered restored at Meridian Development's cost. Harlan Duval was referred for federal prosecution on charges of document fraud and corruption of county officials. The day the findings were announced, Bridget was sitting on the porch of the rooming house when Zane came to tell her, and she read the official document Holt had provided for the land registry and sat with it for several minutes without speaking. He let her have the silence because he understood it was doing necessary work. "It is real," she said finally. "It is real," he confirmed. She looked up at him, and the composure she wore so reliably had a crack in it now. Not grief, but its opposite. The kind of release that happens when you have held something together under tremendous pressure for a long time, and the pressure finally lifts. Her eyes were bright and she pressed her lips together for a moment and then breathed out slowly. "My father never got to see it," she said. "No," Zane said, "but you did, and you fought for it the way he would have." She was quiet for another moment, and then she stood up from the porch steps and looked at him with an expression that had nothing held back in it. An expression he had been watching develop over weeks, layer by layer as the practical urgencies between them had been stripped away, until here it was, clear and complete and looking directly at him. "I would like to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is complicated." "I will," he said. "When all of this is settled and there is no longer a crisis requiring your professional intervention," she said carefully, "do you intend to continue spending your evenings near this porch?" He looked at her for a moment. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether the person who sits on this porch would like that." Her expression shifted in a way that was not quite a smile and was more than one, something that he recognized as relief of a different kind than the land victory had produced, the relief of a risk taken and not regretted. "She would," Bridget said. The months that followed were the best months of Zane Cade's adult life, which was a strange thing to say about a period that also included a federal prosecution that shook the entire county's political structure. But life does not sort itself into clean categories, and the difficult things and the good things arrived together. Tangled, which was, he was learning, simply how life worked when you were living it honestly. Duval resigned the mayorship in October, before the federal trial could begin, and the prosecution proceeded against him as a private citizen. The county council appointed an interim mayor, a quiet man named George Albright who ran the hardware store and had no political ambitions beyond keeping things functioning until a proper election could be organized. Redemption Creek went through a period of adjustment that was sometimes chaotic and sometimes surprisingly constructive. The disinfectant effect of a community that has had corruption exposed and is deciding what it wants to be going forward. Zane kept the badge through all of it. The county had confirmed his position after the deputy's resignation, and the town's relationship with him had shifted, not uniformly but perceptibly. People who had looked away when he walked past now acknowledged him. Men who had filed false complaints against him at Duval's direction quietly dropped the complaints and equally quietly never referred to them again. Nora Finch, whose political instincts were unerring, began leaving substantially better breakfasts on the counter of the sheriff's office. Bridget moved onto the Harlan Flats property in September. She hired 2 men from town to help her build a temporary structure, a one-room cabin near the creek, practical and solid and deliberately simple, while she made longer-term plans for the land. Zane helped when he could, which was often. He discovered that he had a facility for carpentry that he had not exercised in years, and the work of building something with his hands, something that would stand and be used and shelter a person he cared about, satisfied him in a way that was new and whole. One evening they were working on the cabin's window frame, the 2 of them fitting the sash and measuring the opening, and the sun was going down over the mesa and the cottonwoods along the creek were golden with the change of season. And Bridget made a small, precise measurement with the folding ruler and noted it in her book and said, without looking up, "I have been thinking." "About what?" Zane asked. "About the difference between passing through a place and actually living in it," she said. "I have spent a great deal of my life passing through. I want to understand what it feels like to actually be somewhere." "How is it feeling?" he asked. She looked up at him, the golden light on her face, her dark hair loose from its pins in the way it always came loose by the end of an afternoon's work. "Like something I have been missing for a very long time," she said. "The place, and the being here with someone. He set down the measuring tape he was holding and crossed the cabin's half-built floor to her, and she turned to face him and he said, "I am going to say something, and I would like you to hear it entirely before you respond." "All right," she said. "I have not been in love since I was 22 years old," he said. "And that was a version of love that I understand now was largely about someone I imagined rather than someone I knew. I had decided, reasonably I thought, that I was not suited for it, that my life and my temperament and my history made the specific risks of it too high to take. I have been revising that conclusion for approximately the past 3 months. I am now certain the revision is correct. I love you, Bridget, not carefully or conditionally, entirely." The silence that followed was brief. "That was not complicated," she said, "and did not require me to wait for the end before responding." "I told you I would say something," he said, "not that it would be complicated." She stepped forward and closed the remaining distance between them and lifted her face to his, and he kissed her. There in the half-built cabin in the Arizona evening with the cottonwoods golden along the creek and the mesa going red with the last of the sunset. And it was the kind of kiss that is less a beginning than a recognition. The acknowledgement of something that has been true for a long time and has finally been given its name. She said against his shoulder a few minutes later, "I love you too. I have been trying to be sensible about it for quite some time." "How has that been going?" he asked. "Extremely poorly," she said. They were married in December, in the Redemption Creek Church, in a ceremony attended by August Holt, who had returned for the occasion, by Nora Finch and most of the rooming house's residents, by old Cy Reeves, and by George Albright, the interim mayor, who performed the civil portion of the ceremony and seemed genuinely moved by it. Bridget wore a dress of deep green wool that she had ordered from a seamstress in Tucson, and her hair was up with small winter flowers pinned into it. Zane wore his best suit and the silver star and was told by Nora Finch beforehand that he looked distinguished, and told by Bridget upon seeing him that he looked like himself, which was better. They exchanged vows in plain language, honest and specific, rather than ornate. They had written them together, at the kitchen table in the half-finished cabin on a November evening, passing a sheet of paper back and forth, arguing gently about which things mattered most to promise. The vows they settled on were about truth and constancy, and the particular promise to keep choosing each other not just in the easy moments but in the moments when it required effort and courage, which they both understood. The celebration afterward at the hotel lasted until midnight and was characterized by a quantity of food that Nora Finch had organized without being asked, and a degree of communal warmth that Zane found himself unprepared for. The town showing up for something that, he realized, was also about them, about what kind of place they wanted to be, about the story they wanted to tell about Redemption Creek going forward. They moved into the completed cabin in January, the full structure finished now, 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, with a proper hearth and the window they had fitted together in the September evening. Bridget had planted a kitchen garden against the south wall in anticipation of spring, the seeds ordered from a catalog and stored in paper envelopes labeled in her precise handwriting. Zane had built shelves along the main room wall for her books, which arrived in a crate from St. Louis, dozens of them, and he spent an evening watching her shelve them and understanding that the land had begun to anchor someone in the way her father had always hoped it would. The spring brought the planting season, and with it, the revelation of what the Harlan Flats soil was actually capable of. Bridget had studied it the way her father had taught her to study things, methodically and with attention, taking soil samples along the creek bank and the higher ground, and comparing them against reference materials she had sent for. The creekside soil was exceptional, rich and dark with centuries of alluvial deposit, and the first kitchen garden came in with an exuberance that made her laugh, actually laugh, the full, unguarded laugh he had only begun hearing since the winter. "My father was right," she told Zane one June morning, standing in the garden with a basket full of early vegetables, looking out over the valley that was green with the wet spring. "He was always right about this. Are you going to apologize to him?" Zane asked from the fence post he was leaning against. "Silently," she said. "I tell him things sometimes when I am out here in the morning. I suspect he knows." In the summer, Bridget proposed something that Zane had not anticipated but found, upon reflection, entirely characteristic of her. She went to the town council with a proposal to establish a small lending library in Redemption Creek, to be housed in the old courtroom that was no longer needed for council sessions, since the new building had been completed. She had been donating her own books to the school, she explained, but a permanent collection for adult residents would serve the community in ways that the school collection could not. She had contacted book donors in Tucson and Phoenix, had a list of titles and a plan for organization, and needed only the space and a modest budget for shelving. The council approved it unanimously. George Albright, who was running in the upcoming mayoral election on a platform of civic improvement, and was widely expected to win, said it was the best idea that had been presented to the council in the 2 years he had been sitting on it. The library opened in September, exactly 1 year after Bridget had first moved onto the Harlan Flats property, and the town turned out for it with the same communal warmth that had characterized the wedding, a community recognizing one of its own and celebrating something she had made. Zane stood near the back of the room and watched Bridget showing the collection to a group of miners' wives who were examining the shelves with the particular attention of people who have not had regular access to books and understand what that access means. He watched her face as she talked about the volumes, the animation in it, the pleasure she took in matching a reader with a book, and he felt the particular richness of a life that has found its shape, has become what it was always capable of being. In the late fall of that year, Bridget told him she was expecting a child. They were at the kitchen table after dinner, the oil lamp between them, and she told him in the direct way she told him everything important, looking at him squarely and watching his face. He sat with it for a moment, the enormity of it settling through him in layers, and then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing he thought of, which she told him later was the right first thing. "Perfectly," she said. "I saw the doctor yesterday. He says early May." He was quiet for another moment. "I did not expect to feel like this," he said. "What does it feel like?" she asked. "Like the thing I have been working toward my whole life without knowing it," he said, "which I understand sounds impossibly large." "It does not sound impossibly large," she said. "It sounds accurate." He got up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her very carefully, which made her laugh because she reminded him, not made of glass, but he held her carefully anyway, and the lamp burned between the windows, and outside the Arizona sky was full of stars, and the creek ran over its stones in the dark. The winter was the warmest and quietest of Zane's life. They spent long evenings reading by the fire. Bridget's collection of books spread across the household now in the comfortable disorder of things that are genuinely used, and they talked in the way they had always talked, about everything, about the library and the farm plans for spring and the books they were reading, and the memories they each carried from before, the dark past being slowly, gently converted into something that informed the present without controlling it. He told her more of his father's story, the details he had kept private for years, the specific loss and what it had meant, and the long shadow it had cast. She listened in the way she always listened, and at the end she said, "Your father would be glad that the thing he taught you became protection rather than destruction. Some people carry loss like that, and it makes them cruel. It did not do that to you. It came close," he said honestly. "But it did not," she said. "You chose differently." The baby arrived in early May, which the doctor had said and which was accurate. It was a boy, born on a Tuesday morning while the apple trees Bridget had planted along the south wall flowered white, and he was perfect and loud and expressed his opinions about the world immediately and at volume, which made Zane, sitting beside the bed with Bridget's hand in his, laugh through something that was almost tears and was the most complete feeling he had ever had. They named him Thomas for her father. Thomas James Cade, James being for Zane's father, who had been called Jim and who deserved the acknowledgement. Two names for two men who had shaped the people who now held this small, furious, beloved person, and looked at each other over his head with the specific expression of people who have arrived at exactly the right place. Redemption Creek grew through the years that followed. The railroad came through in 1882, which brought exactly the investment and activity that Duval had predicted, except that it arrived in a town that had cleaner governance than before and a more equitable distribution of its benefits. The Harlan Flats property, with the railroad access, became exactly as valuable as Duval had known it would be. Bridget's reaction to this was characteristically measured. She expanded the farm operation strategically, added several acres of orchard, and reinvested substantially in the library, which by 1883 had a second room and a part-time librarian, and was the best facility of its kind between Tucson and Phoenix. Duval was convicted on 3 counts of federal document fraud in 1879 and served his sentence, and upon release went to California, which was far enough that it did not trouble anyone in Redemption Creek. The county surveyor left the territory. Deputy Ferris eventually became a saloon keeper in a town 40 miles west, which seemed to suit his particular set of skills. Zane kept the sheriff's position through 1884, when George Albright, by then in his second term as mayor, appointed a younger man to the role, and Zane retired from official law enforcement with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done a job well and finished it cleanly. He spent a year working the farm full-time, which he discovered he was good at in the methodical, patient way he was good at most things, and which had the additional advantage of keeping him physically present on the land he had come to love as deeply as Bridget did. Young Thomas, at 3 years old, was already demonstrating his mother's intellectual curiosity and his father's determined stubbornness, which in combination made him both formidable and exhausting. He had strong opinions about which books should be read to him at bedtime and would engage in extended negotiations about procedure that Zane found both maddening and secretly impressive. In the spring of 1884, Bridget told him she was expecting again. "May again?" he asked. "October, the doctor thinks," she said. "We are branching out seasonally." He was, he found, just as overwhelmed as the first time, which he had not expected. The feeling did not diminish with repetition. The world continued to be astonishing. The second child was a girl, born in October in the cabin that had been expanded twice now, and was no longer exactly a cabin but a proper farmhouse with a wide porch facing the valley and bookshelves in every room and a kitchen garden that had long since outgrown its original borders. They named her Clara Rose, for no one in particular but for the world, for the rightness of the name, and she arrived into it with her eyes open and looking around with an alertness that the doctor said was unusual, and that Bridget took to mean exactly what it appeared to mean. Thomas, at 4, was uncertain about the development for approximately 2 weeks, and then became aggressively protective of his sister in a way that manifested as a constant narrative commentary on her activities and well-being, which Clara, as she grew, tolerated with the patience of someone who understood she was loved even when the love was loud. The years shaped themselves into a life. The farm, the library, the two children growing through their stages, the long evenings and the early mornings, the rhythm of seasons on land that knew them now, that bore the marks of their hands. Bridget's garden in its annual abundance, the apple trees in flower, and then fruit, the creek running along the eastern boundary as it had run before they arrived and would run after, the red mesa catching the light in the evenings the way it always had. They had arguments, as people in close quarters do, about money and decisions and the children's upbringing and the proper management of the property, and a dozen other things. They argued in the honest, direct way that two people argue when they have both committed to truth as a baseline, which meant the arguments were sometimes sharp and always finite, because neither of them could maintain a position they knew to be wrong for very long, and both of them knew when to stop. Zane learned over years that the locked room inside his chest that he had thought was simply the permanent result of damage was actually just a room that had not found the right person to inhabit it. Once it was open, it stayed open, which was sometimes uncomfortable, because openness is its own kind of vulnerability, but it was the kind of discomfort that was indistinguishable from being fully alive. He told Bridget this once, in the way he sometimes told her things that he had been thinking about for a long time, on a quiet evening when the children were asleep, and they were sitting on the wide porch with the valley spread out below them in the blue dusk. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the difference between surviving and living." "Tell me," she said. She had put down her book, which meant she was listening completely. "I spent a very long time surviving," he said, "doing the work, maintaining the position, keeping things functional. I believed that was as much as was reasonable to want, given everything. I believed the wanting of more was a trap." "And now?" she asked. He looked out at the valley, at the last light on the mesa, at the cottonwoods dark along the creek. He thought about the day he had stood here for the first time and felt the land's particular beauty reach into him and believed, for a moment, in the possibility of something stable and real. "Now I know it was not a trap," he said. "It was the whole point." She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the gathering dark, and the stars came out over the Arizona territory the way they always did, sudden and complete, as if the dark had been holding them all day. Thomas found them on the porch, as he sometimes did, having not quite stayed asleep, and climbed into his father's lap without ceremony, and put his head down with the complete trust of a child who has never had a reason to doubt that the world will catch him. Zane held his son and felt his wife warm beside him, and the valley was quiet below, the creek running in the dark, the land staying the way land stays, patient and present and exactly what it was. The spring after Clara's 5th birthday brought a development that surprised them both. A letter arrived from a law firm in Tucson, representing the estate of a distant Marlowe cousin, who had died without direct heirs, leaving a modest but meaningful sum that Bridget had never known existed. Family money from a generation back that had been quietly accumulating in a trust, and had now, by the logic of the family tree, come to her. She read the letter twice and sat with it, and then looked at Zane with the expression he knew meant she was making a decision. "The north section," she said. "We have been talking about whether to develop it or leave it. I would like to do something with it." "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "A school," she said. "Not the town school, they have that. For the children on the outlying farms and ranches who cannot make the daily trip into town. A small school right here with a proper building and a teacher. He looked at her. You would run it yourself, he said. It was not a question. Initially, she said. Until we found someone else, but yes, initially. He thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Yes, he said. You did not think about it, she said. I have learned to trust your ideas, he said. It tends to save time. The school opened the following autumn in a purpose-built structure on the north section of the Harlan Flats property. A single room with good windows for light and benches enough for 20 students. The first enrollment was 11 children from farms within a 5-mile radius, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Bridget taught them reading, arithmetic, history, and basic natural science with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had finally found the precise application of everything she knew. Thomas was in the school's first class, which he greeted with a mixture of enthusiasm and complaint that was characteristic of him. Clara, at 5, was too young but sat in the back of the room and listened anyway, and Bridget let her because Clara's listening face was nearly identical to her own, and she did not have the heart to send her out. Zane found himself, that autumn, in the unusual position of having more time than he was used to, the farm running smoothly, his official duties ended, the immediate urgencies of the past years resolved. He spent some of it doing the maintenance work that a working farm always generated, and some of it helping with the school's practical needs, and some of it doing something he had not done since boyhood, which was simply sitting by the creek in the late afternoons and being in a place without requiring anything of it. He thought about the forced choice that had set everything in motion, the morning in Duval's courthouse, when the entire edifice of his official standing had been placed on one side of the scale, and a stranger woman's legitimate claim had been placed on the other. He had not, in that moment, known Bridget well. He had known her for 3 weeks. He had known the facts of her case thoroughly, and had known her somewhat and had known, with a clarity that surprised him, which choice he could live with. What he had not known in that moment was what the choice was actually choosing. He had thought he was choosing the law over convenience, which was true. He had not yet understood that he was also choosing a life, the specific and irreplaceable life he was now living, the farm and the library and the children, and the woman who looked at him with eyes that knew everything about him and chose him anyway. He was sitting by the creek in this manner on a November afternoon when Bridget appeared at the bank beside him, having finished the school day and walked through the cottonwoods. She sat down next to him and took off her boots and put her feet near the water, which was cold now, late autumn, the cottonwoods bare and gold on the ground. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The courthouse," he said. "That morning." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about it too," she said. "I was frightened that morning, though I was trying very hard not to show it. I had been fighting for 3 weeks, and it had not been clear that it was going to work, and Duval seemed so entirely certain that he would get what he wanted." "Were you frightened by him?" Zane asked. "By the situation," she said. "By the possibility that the law was simply not going to work, that the system was too captured to be useful. I had started to make a secondary plan in my head for what I would do if I lost. Go back to St. Louis. Let the land go. I did not want to, but I was being realistic. And then," he prompted. She looked at him. "And then you walked out with me," she said. "And the way you walked out, as if it were the only possible thing to do, as if the choice were genuinely not difficult, as if my claim were simply worth it, no calculation required." She paused. "I had been in a very long sequence of situations where I was not worth it in one way or another. Watching you not calculate made me understand that was not a permanent condition." He took her hand, the familiar, solid warmth of it. "You were always worth it," he said. "I simply had the advantage of being able to see that clearly. You make it sound uncomplicated, she said. It was, he said. In that moment, the complications came after. The best things usually do, she said. They sat by the creek in the November afternoon, the cold water running past, the bare cottonwood branches moving in the high, thin air, and the mesa to the northeast caught the last of the sun and held it, red and warm, the same way it always had, the same way it would tomorrow, and the year after, and the years beyond, steady and present. The land staying the way land stays, waiting for the people who know how to arrive and remain. From the north section, faint through the cottonwoods, they could hear the sound of children's voices, Thomas instructing Clara in something with his characteristic authority, Clara responding with her characteristic patience, and the sound of it reached Zane and Bridget where they sat by the creek, and they looked at each other with the particular completeness of people who have arrived, who are here, who know where they are and want it. The evening star appeared above the mesa, precise and early, the first light in the sky before the dark came fully down. "We should go in," Bridget said, not moving. "We should," Zane agreed, not moving.